The information that shocked many analysts today, and many others too. NATO initiated direct negotiations with the Kremlin and was preparing to surrender the Baltic states to Russia at the beginning of the full-scale attack by the Russian Federation on Ukraine. Such a striking admission was made by the former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. In 2021, the then NATO Secretary General discussed with the Russian authorities the withdrawal of alliance troops from Eastern European countries and the creation of a so-called buffer zone in the Baltic states. This is mentioned in Stoltenberg's own memoirs. Moreover, it is stated that the Secretary General of the alliance initiated secret negotiations with the Russians, which the Baltic countries were not even aware of. Well, for example, in the fall of 2021, Stoltenberg met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and suggested discussing the Kremlin's idea of creating a so-called buffer zone in Europe or rolling NATO back to its 1997 borders. And in fact, only the armed forces of Ukraine were able to stop the Russians, while NATO, was ready to abandon its own. But that's far from all of Jens Stoltenberg's revelations, so in this episode I'll tell you not only about what you've probably already read somewhere in Telegram channels, but also about something even more interesting. Stoltenberg shared some interesting things. Well, for example, he is proud that in the first days of Russia's war against Ukraine, he flatly refused to provide military assistance to Volodymyr Zelensky. He also recalls that some countries in Europe in general discouraged helping Ukraine. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start this episode, I ask you to support the work of this YouTube channel with your donation, subscription, or sponsorship. If you still find our channel important, interesting, and worth supporting, you can support it financially. All the links and details on how to do this are in the description of this video. It says support Alexei Pechi's channel. Choose any format that is convenient for you. I will be grateful for any support. And subscribe to the Pechi News Telegram channel. The link is also in the description. So, now let's go through everything step by step. In the book called NATO Leadership During War, former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg sometimes briefly digresses into earlier periods of his life. But the main focus, as the title promises, is on the decade from 2014 to 2024, during which Stoltenberg led the North Atlantic Alliance. This is written by journalist Melis Oitsalu, and I'll immediately quote him. As a reader, I found the book's title contradictory, both morally and factually. NATO was not at war during Stoltenberg's time in office. The war in Afghanistan, of course, was an official armed conflict, but compared to Russia's war against Ukraine, that event hardly deserved to be called a war. It was more of a counter-terrorism operation, which at times escalated into military action. Considering how few pages in these memoirs are devoted to Afghanistan compared to the war in Ukraine, it becomes clear that Stoltenberg went a bit too far with the book's title, especially considering NATO's noticeable passivity in the first months of the war. Only in 2024 did the alliance formalize its military support for Ukraine by creating a national agency to provide security assistance and training for Ukraine. Before that, even the mission to train Ukrainian soldiers was carried out under the auspices of the European military, not NATO. Let me remind you once again that Stoltenberg's memoir is called NATO Leadership During the War. And then the journalist reveals a shocking confession from Stoltenberg in this book. As it turned out, in the first months of Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine, Jens Stoltenberg did not support Volodymyr Zelensky's requests. In his book, he proudly describes how he firmly slammed his fist on the table and turned Zelensky down in his hour of need when the president of Ukraine turned to NATO for help with air defense. Moreover, Stoltenberg confirms that in the West, many at the beginning of the war assumed that Kiev would fall very quickly. As Jens admits, the US had reliable intelligence that Russia intended to attack Ukraine as early as mid-October 2021, after which the CIA requested an emergency audience with him. Well, listen, they're definitely planning to attack. We need to do something. At the same time, the intelligence assessments of France and Germany were sharply different from those of the US. Paris and Berlin considered the threat of an invasion of Ukraine to be exaggerated and emphasized the need to avoid it. and Stoltenberg was leaning towards the French and German camps when it came to concerns about escalation. And I was amazed, but Stoltenberg writes quite openly in his memoirs that his task was to show Vladimir Putin that NATO does not want war. Moreover, Stoltenberg admits that he and his father insisted on maintaining a dialogue with Russia, even in those cases when most allies rejected this idea. Stoltenberg proudly writes about how he managed to successfully establish a dialogue with the Russians within NATO, even after the annexation of Crimea. Unlike Zelensky's desire for more decisive military assistance, he says, "Look, Zelensky wanted to fight, but I managed to establish a dialogue with the wild Russians, so that's great." And as Stoltenberg writes, for him, dialogue with Russia was a sign of strength, not weakness. So he says, "I was strong because I talked to those wild Russians." And in the chapter of his memoirs titled The War of August, on April 21, 2023, Stoltenberg recalls a personal meeting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, in the fall of 2021. And he admits that despite being aware of the opposition both from Poland and the Baltic countries, nevertheless, he suggested to Lavrov that the Russia-NATO Council discuss the Russian idea of creating a buffer zone in the border areas and withdrawing Allied troops to the positions that existed before 1997. That is, Stoltenberg was ready to fulfill absolutely all the demands of the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. But as they say, so as not to blame Stoltenberg alone, it should also be noted that shortly after this dialogue between Stoltenberg and Lavrov, the United States publicly declared its readiness to discuss the deployment of forces in Europe. This turned into a deeply unpleasant episode for the Baltic countries. In this regard, Estonian diplomats confirm that Stoltenberg really tried to raise this issue behind the backs of the countries on NATO's eastern border. In January 2022, the Russia-NATO Council was convened in the hope that Russia's constructive intentions would become clear there. But the Russians instead, as Stoltenberg writes, paradoxically stated that their proposal was not a menu from which you can choose a suitable dish, but an offer based on the principle of take it or leave it. But Stoltenberg didn't even consult with Poland and the Baltic countries, meaning he simply wanted to betray the allies to Russia. And here I would note that if the NATO Secretary-General calmly considers the idea that the order in Europe that existed before 1997 could somehow be partially restored, under the guise of measures to build trust with the Russians, then this is no longer about reducing risks, it's about redistributing risks. And such questions are simply beyond Stoltenberg's authority to decide in his position. That is, at the very least, this should have been discussed with the Allies. And here's an interesting point for you. In Estonia, the top leadership publicly confirmed that no one in NATO has publicly discussed anyone agreeing to any kind of deal with the Russians. And that's why it raises the question of what kind of consensus decision Stoltenberg was actually relying on when, for example, he so firmly said no to Volodymyr Zelensky from the very beginning. But Stoltenberg also reveals that in the first days of the war, then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson stated directly at a closed meeting that they could not start shooting down Russian planes. And Emmanuel Macron warns that excessive European intervention could strengthen the Russian narrative about NATO's direct involvement. That's why he urged not to interfere too much in this war. He said, listen, God forbid, God forbid. Putin will think that we are also fighting. No, by no means. Well, and here I'll give you a quote from that very journalist, Aitsalu. As the meeting between Stoltenberg and Lavrov shows, which the former Secretary General himself describes with unusual candor, for NATO's eastern flank, a sensible middle ground may mean ignoring the interests of countries that joined the alliance later. Stoltenberg tends to view dialogue as a value-neutral procedure, as if the very channel of communication is already some kind of virtue. In reality, everything depends on what is being normalized through this dialogue. From the perspective of a small state, dialogue is never an abstract and absolute virtue. In certain situations, the price of dialogue may be a decrease in the level of security. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, it's very important. Click the bell and don't forget to like. If you found the information useful and interesting, you can support the work of this YouTube channel with your donation, for example, using the QR code on your screens or the links in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.